The cowboy stopped his horse the moment he saw what the woman was still clutching in the middle of the blizzard. Snow blasted through the empty station as the woman's fingers slipped from the leather medical bag onto the frozen bench. Across the tracks, a loose metal sign slammed against its chain over and over. Then heavy boots crossed the platform. The cowboy crouched beside her, looked once at the blood on her sleeve, and suddenly took off his own coat without a word. What he noticed next made him stare at her much longer than he should have. "Tell me where you're watching from before the storm rolls in." The winter storm rolled down from the Rockies like something alive. Snow swept across Black Hollow in long white sheets, swallowing wagon tracks, porch rails, and the narrow boardwalks between buildings. The church bell had stopped ringing an hour earlier. Even the saloon piano had gone quiet. Only the train station still stood awake beneath the storm. Vivian Brooks sat alone on a wooden bench near the far wall, her shoulders curled beneath a thin brown coat stiff with melted snow. The oil lamp above her flickered every few seconds, throwing weak gold across the waiting room before the wind rattled the windows again. Her hands barely moved anymore. Still, she kept them wrapped tightly around the old leather medical bag resting in her lap. The brass buckle pressed against her numb fingers. She held onto it anyway. Outside, somewhere beyond the frozen tracks, a train whistle sounded once through the mountains, faint, far away, then nothing. The station master had left before dark. "Lines buried past Copper Ridge," he'd muttered while locking the ticket office. "No train till the weather breaks." After that, he never looked at her again. Vivian lowered her eyes toward the floorboards. Melted snow dripped steadily from the hem of her dress. Near her boot sat a folded paper stamped with the seal of St. Agnes Hospital in St. Louis. Dismissed. The word still sat sharp in her chest, not because she had done wrong, because she had refused to stay quiet. She could still feel Dr. Roland Mercer's fingers digging into her wrist inside the medicine room 3 weeks earlier. Smell the whiskey on his breath. Hear the crash of glass when she shoved him backward into the cabinet. The next morning they called her immoral. By evening her locker had been emptied into a cardboard box. A hard gust struck the station windows. Vivian flinched slightly and pulled the coat tighter round herself. Her lips had gone pale from the cold. Across the street, light spilled through the windows of McGrady's saloon and hotel. Laughter drifted faintly through the storm whenever the door opened. Warmth, coffee, stew, a different world. Nobody crossed toward the station. Nobody wanted trouble in winter, especially not trouble carrying a medical bag and nowhere to go. Vivian closed her eyes for a moment. Her mother's photograph rested inside the bag beneath a bundle of bandages and a cracked thermometer. Sometimes she touched the edge of the picture just to remind herself she had once belonged somewhere. A sudden sound rose through the storm. Hoofbeats, slow, heavy, near. Vivian lifted her head. Through the white curtain of snow, a rider emerged from the darkness. Tall horse, dark wool coat, wide shoulders bent slightly against the wind. Snow clung to the brim of his hat and the beard's shadow along his jaw. The horse stopped near the station steps. For a second, neither of them moved. Then the rider swung down into the snow. The station door groaned open. Cold air rushed inside with him, carrying the smell of leather, cedar smoke, and frozen pine. He shut the door behind him and removed one glove. Gray eyes settled on her first, then on the medical bag. "You waiting on a train?" he asked. His voice was deep, roughened by cold and long days outdoors. Vivian tried to answer quickly, but her throat caught halfway through. "Morning line," she managed softly. The man glanced once toward the dark ticket office window. "Ain't gonna be one." Silence settled again. Up close, he looked older than she first thought. Maybe late 30s. A faint scar crossed the edge of his chin. Snow melted slowly across the shoulders of his black coat. He studied her trembling hands another moment. Then his jaw tightened slightly. "You've been sitting here long?" Vivian looked away instead of answering. That seemed answer enough. The man reached up, removed his heavy coat, and shoved toward her. She stiffened immediately. He noticed, so he stopped just short of touching her. "Easy," he said quietly. "Just trying to keep you alive." He draped the coat carefully around her shoulders. The warmth trapped inside the thick wool nearly hurt against her frozen skin. Vivian swallowed hard. "No money," she whispered automatically. "I can't pay for a room." The man pulled his gloves back on. "Nobody freezes alone in my town." Outside, the storm hammered the roof hard enough to shake the rafters. He bent down, lifted her medical bag before she could protest, then offered his hand. Vivian stared at it. Strong hand, scarred knuckles, steady, not rushed, not demanding, just there. Finally, slowly, she placed her numb fingers into his palm. His grip tightened carefully around hers as he helped her stand. The room tilted for half a second beneath her feet. The stranger caught her elbow before she fell. "What's your name?" she asked, faintly, as they moved toward the door. He opened it against the wind. "Wyatt Bennett." Even through the storm, the name landed heavy. Everyone in Colorado Territory knew the Bennett ranches. Cattle, timber, railroad contracts, money older than half the town. Across the street, the saloon door swung open, just as Wyatt guided her through the snow. Conversation inside stopped almost instantly. Men looked up from whiskey glasses. Cards lowered slowly onto tables. Nobody said a word as Wyatt Bennett walked through the front door carrying a black nurse's weathered medical bag beside him. The innkeeper blinked once. Wyatt spoke before the man could ask questions. "Need coffee, hot water, and the upstairs room near the stove." The innkeeper nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Vivian felt dozens of eyes following her while Wyatt guided her toward the fire. The heat struck her face first. Then the smell of beef stew and burning oak. Her knees nearly gave out beside the hearth. Wyatt caught the back of the chair and steadied it before she sat. For the first time in days, warmth reached her hands. She stared into the fire silently. Across from her, Wyatt removed his hat and brushed melting snow from the brim. The flames lit the sharp edges of his face in golden shadow. He looked like a man used to carrying things alone. After a while, he nodded once toward the medical bag beside her chair. "You a doctor?" "No." The fire cracked softly. "I was a nurse." Wyatt glanced at her again. Not pity, not curiosity, just quiet attention. Then he said, "Was?" Vivian's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the blanket resting over her lap. Outside, wind screamed down the empty street. Inside, the fire kept burning. And for the first time since leaving St. Louis, Vivian Brooks felt something more dangerous than fear. She felt warm. The storm raged through most of the night. Wind shoved against the hotel windows hard enough to rattle the glass, but the fire beside Vivian's chair never died. Sometime after midnight, the innkeeper's wife brought up thick beef stew and a chipped blue mug filled with coffee so dark it looked black in the firelight. Vivian ate slowly, like someone afraid the meal might disappear if she moved too fast. Across the room, Wyatt Bennett sat near the window with one boot hooked beneath his chair, quietly reading through cattle receipts by lamplight. Snow melted from the edge of his coat onto the floorboards beside him. He barely spoke. Now and then he looked toward the street, or toward her, never long enough to make her uneasy. Near dawn, Vivian woke beneath 2 wool blankets in the small upstairs room. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the scent of pine smoke drifted through the cracks in the floorboards, and memory returned all at once. St. Louis, the train, the storm, Wyatt Bennett. She sat up too quickly and pressed a hand against her temple. On the washstand beside the bed sat a clean towel, a small bar of soap, and a folded paper receipt from the hotel restaurant downstairs. Paid in full, no signature. She stared at it quietly. Outside, morning light spread pale blue across Black Hollow. Snow sat waist-deep against the buildings, and men were already shoveling paths along Main Street. when Vivian stepped downstairs wearing the same wrinkled brown dress from the station. Conversation in the dining room lowered just enough for her to notice. A spoon paused halfway to someone's mouth. A chair creaked. Then silence again. Wyatt sat alone near the stove with a tin coffee cup beside his elbow. He looked up once when she approached. "You sleep any?" "A little." He nodded toward the empty chair across from him. "Eat first." A plate of eggs, biscuits, and fried salt pork already waited there. Vivian hesitated. "I can't keep accepting." "You can," he said simply. The waitress arrived with fresh coffee before Vivian could answer. Steam curled upward between them. For several minutes, neither spoke. Outside, wagon wheels crunched through packed snow. Finally, Wyatt folded the paper in front of him and slid it aside. "Road east won't open for days," he said. "Maybe longer." Vivian lowered her eyes toward the table. She already knew. "You got somewhere to go after that?" The question sat gently between them. No pressure, no pity. Vivian rubbed her thumb along the cracked handle of the coffee cup. "I had a letter from a mining camp near Utah," she admitted. "Said they needed a nurse." She gave a faint breath that almost became a laugh. That was before winter buried half the territory. Wyatt studied her quietly. "You any good?" The question surprised her enough that she looked up immediately. "What?" "At nursing." No mockery in his face, just plain curiosity. Vivian straightened slightly in her chair. "Yes." Wyatt nodded once, like that settled something. "Frost Ridge could use somebody good." She frowned faintly. "Frost Ridge? My ranch." He took another sip of coffee before continuing. 60 miles north. Men get hurt regular enough. Broken fingers, wire cuts, horse kicks. His eyes moved briefly toward the window. "And the town doctor drinks more than he heals." Vivian looked down at her hands. The skin across her knuckles had split from cold during the journey west. "You don't know anything about me. I know you carried that medical bag through a blizzard instead of leaving it behind." Wyatt leaned back slightly in his chair. "Tells me enough to start." Silence returned, not uncomfortable this time, the kind that settles slow between two tired people. By noon, the storm finally weakened. Wyatt's horse waited outside the hotel beside a second mount, fitted with fresh blankets and a side satchel tied neatly behind the saddle. Someone had brushed the snow from both animals until their coats shined dark beneath the winter sun. Vivian stopped beside the steps. "You planned this already?" Wyatt tightened a strap beneath the second horse's saddle. "I figured you'd need a choice before you needed another train." The words stayed with her while he handed over a pair of lined leather gloves. New, soft inside, too expensive for a stranger. Vivian stared at them a moment before slipping them on carefully. They fit perfectly. The ride north took most of the afternoon. Black Hollow disappeared behind them beneath drifting snow and chimney smoke, while the mountains opened wider ahead. Pine forests climbed the hillsides in dark waves. Frozen streams cut silver through the valleys. Wyatt rode slightly ahead most of the way, never crowding her horse. Every so often he glanced back to make sure she was still there. Near sunset they reached the ridge. Below them sat Frost Ridge Ranch, long cedar barns, wide corrals, smoke curling from 3 chimneys, dozens of horses moving across white pastureland. The ranch spread beneath the mountains like its own small town. Vivian slowed her horse slightly. "It's bigger than I expected." Wyatt rested one hand on the saddle horn. "Built it 15 years ago with 2 hired men and a broken fence line." A faint shadow crossed his face. "Most things worth keeping start rough." As they rode through the main gate, several ranch hands looked up from unloading hay bales. One older cowboy tipped his hat toward Wyatt. Then his eyes shifted toward Vivian. The pause lasted half a second too long. A tall man stepped down from the porch near the bunkhouse, same dark hair as Wyatt, sharper mouth, Harlan Bennett. His gaze moved from Vivian to Wyatt and back again. "You bring home company now?" Wyatt dismounted calmly. "She's staying a while." Harlan's expression barely changed. but something cold settled behind his eyes. "Well," he said slowly, "that'll give folks something to talk about." Wyatt shut the gate behind the horses with more force than necessary. Folks always talk. Harlan looked at Vivian once more before turning away toward the barn. Snow drifted quietly through the yard after he disappeared. Vivian wrapped her fingers tighter around the reins. For the first time since leaving the station, warmth slipped slightly from her chest. Wyatt noticed. He stepped beside her horse and rested one hand lightly near the saddle strap. "You don't owe anybody here an explanation," he said. The evening wind carried the smell of cedar smoke across the ranch. Somewhere in the distance, a horse stamped against frozen ground. Vivian looked down at the sprawling ranch beneath the darkening mountains, then at the man standing beside her. And, for reasons she didn't fully understand yet, she climbed down from the saddle and followed Wyatt Bennett toward the lights of Frost Ridge. The ranch house smelled like cedar wood, coffee grounds, and wet wool, drying near the stove. A woman in her 60s looked up from the kitchen table when they entered, gray hair pinned tight, flour still dusted across one sleeve. Her eyes settled on Vivian first, not unfriendly, just careful. "This is Martha Green," Wyatt said while removing his gloves. "She keeps this place standing." Martha wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the room. "You look half frozen," she said plainly to Vivian. "Sit down before you fall down." The words carried no softness, but the older woman was already pulling a kettle off the stove. Vivian sat carefully near the fire while Wyatt disappeared upstairs. A few moments later, he returned holding a folded wool blanket and a clean nightdress someone must have stored years ago. He placed both beside her chair. "You can use the cabin near the north fence," he said. "Used to belong to my foreman before he moved east." His voice stayed even. "There's a stove, water pump outside. Roof still holds." Vivian nodded once. "Thank you." Wyatt looked like he might say something more. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and set a brass key beside the blanket. Then he walked back outside into the dark. The cabin sat beyond the horse corrals near a frozen creek lined with pine trees. Small, quiet. Smoke already curled from the chimney by the time Vivian reached it with Martha carrying a lantern ahead of her. "He lit the stove before supper," Martha muttered while unlocking the door. "Man acts like he doesn't notice people, but he notices everything." Inside, the room held little more than a narrow bed, a wash basin, a wooden table, and shelves lined with old jars. A faded quilt rested neatly across the mattress. Vivian stood still for a long moment. After weeks of train stations, crowded rail cars, and strange rooms, the silence inside the cabin almost frightened her. Martha set the lantern down. "You hungry?" Vivian shook her head gently. "Tired more than anything." Martha studied her face another second before nodding. "Well, breakfast comes at 5. Ranch hands eat early." She hesitated near the door. "And if you're fixing to stay here a while, folks'll stare at first. That's just how people are." The lantern light flickered softly across the walls. Vivian lowered her eyes. "I'm used to staring." Something in Martha's expression shifted then. Not pity, recognition. "Get some sleep," she said quietly before stepping outside. The days that followed settled into a rhythm carried by cold mornings and long silences. Vivian rose before dawn most days. She heated water on the small iron stove, pinned her hair back carefully, then crossed the snowy yard toward the bunkhouse carrying her medical bag. The first cowboy who came to her was a young ranch hand named Ely Cooper. Deep wire cut across his palm from broken fencing. He stood awkwardly near the stable doors while Vivian cleaned the wound. "You really worked in a hospital back east?" he asked. "Yes, big one, big enough." He watched her wrap the bandage with quiet surprise. "You stitch faster than Doc Wilkes in town." Vivian almost smiled. "Then maybe Doc Wilkes should stop drinking during treatments." The young cowboy barked out a laugh before quickly trying to hide it. By the end of the week, more men started showing up outside her cabin. Burned fingers, bad coughs, horse bites. One older ranch hand arrived limping from an infected knee and left carrying fresh bandages wrapped neat as church linen. Still, whispers moved through Frost Ridge like cold wind under a door. Vivian heard them in pieces, near the feed shed, outside the chapel after Sunday service, inside the general store when she stepped near the flour barrels. Wyatt never commented on any of it, but twice she returned to the cabin after dark to find fresh-cut firewood stacked neatly beside her porch. And one bitter morning, after a hard freeze shattered part of her window latch, she came back from the bunkhouse to find Wyatt repairing it himself. Snow drifted around his boots while he tightened the screws with a small hand tool. "You didn't have to do that," Vivian said quietly. Wyatt glanced over his shoulder. "Wind gets worse after January. That still doesn't mean glass breaks easier in cold weather." He said it like that settled everything. Vivian stood near the porch steps watching him work. Strong hands, steady movements, the kind of silence that asked for nothing back. That evening the temperature dropped below zero. Wind rattled the cabin walls after supper, while Vivian boiled instruments in a metal pan beside the stove. She was rolling fresh bandages when someone knocked once against the door. Wyatt stood outside, holding one shoulder stiff beneath his coat. "Fence wire snapped loose," he said. "Caught me climbing through." Inside, under the lamp glow, Vivian carefully cleaned the cut, stretching across his shoulder. The wound wasn't deep, but the skin around it had swollen from cold. Wyatt sat silent in the chair while she threaded the needle. "You always this stubborn?" she asked softly. "Mostly." The corner of her mouth moved slightly. Vivian leaned closer to stitch the wound. As she pulled the torn fabric of his shirt aside, her fingers brushed against an older scar crossing the center of his chest. Long, pale, not from ranch work. Wyatt's hand closed suddenly around her wrist. Not hard, just instinct. Both of them froze. The storm outside groaned against the cabin roof. For several seconds, neither moved. Vivian slowly lifted her eyes toward his. Wyatt looked down at her hand resting near the scar, then loosened his grip at once. "Sorry," he said quietly. The word sounded unfamiliar coming from him. Vivian said nothing. But she noticed the way he turned slightly away afterward, like a man protecting something already broken. Later, after he left, Vivian stood beside the frosted window, watching his figure disappear across the snowy yard toward the darkened barn near the far fence line. The same barn nobody ever seemed to enter. And for the first time since arriving at Frost Ridge, she found herself wondering not whether Wyatt Bennett could be trusted, but what had happened to make a man like him live with so much silence. January settled hard across the mountains. Snow buried the north fence posts nearly halfway to the rails, and the creek behind Vivian's cabin froze thick enough for coyotes to cross at night. Most mornings began before sunrise with lantern light moving through the ranch yard and the sound of boots grinding over packed ice. Vivian had started leaving her cabin door unlocked during the day, not because she trusted everyone, because injured men kept arriving before breakfast. One came with a cracked wrist after falling from a horse near Red Hollow Pass. Another with frostbite along 2 fingers after getting stranded overnight checking cattle lines. By the second week of January, even the ranch hands who once watched her from a distance now knocked before entering. "Morning, Miss Vivian. Got a cough, won't quit. Think this cut's gone bad." She treated them all the same. Quiet voice, steady hands, clean bandages folded sharp at the corners. Word traveled farther than Frost Ridge. Sometimes wagons appeared from neighboring ranches, carrying children with fevers, or old miners with swollen joints wrapped in blankets. Martha started keeping extra coffee warm on the stove because people always stayed longer than expected. Still, Harlan Bennett never stopped watching her. One afternoon, Vivian stepped into the main barn, carrying fresh salve for a ranch hand's shoulder burn, and found Harlan standing beside Wyatt near the feed room. "You're turning this place into a charity ward," Harlan muttered. Wyatt kept checking inventory numbers inside a ledger book. "She's helping. She's temporary." That word hung in the cold air. Temporary. Vivian pretended not to hear it while handing over the medicine tin. But Wyatt's jaw tightened slightly. That night, a storm rolled down from the mountains faster than expected. The wind began around supper. By dark, snow hammered the ranch building sideways. Lanterns swayed on their hooks. Horses screamed nervously from the corrals. Vivian was boiling water inside her cabin when the first shout cut through the storm outside. Then, another. A horse crashed violently against wood fencing somewhere near the lower stables. Vivian opened the door just as Wyatt sprinted across the yard through waist-high snow. "Stay inside," he shouted. Another scream followed, smaller this time. A child. Vivian grabbed her coat immediately. The lower horse pen had collapsed beneath drifting snow and panicked animals. Men fought the wind, trying to pull frightened horses back from the broken rails, while lantern light jumped wildly across the white darkness. Near the fence line, a boy lay motionless beside the trampled snow. Noah Walker, the stable master's son, maybe 10 years old, blood soaked through one side of his coat. His father knelt beside him, shaking so badly he could barely speak. "He got caught in the wire," the man gasped. Horse dragged him half the yard. Vivian dropped beside the boy instantly. Cold hands moved with sudden purpose. She cut through fabric near the wound. Blood pulsed dark against the snow. Too much, too fast. Wyatt crouched beside her while wind whipped snow across both their faces. "Tell me what you need." Vivian pressed hard against the torn flesh with folded cloth. "Heat, clean water, every lantern you can find." Her voice stayed frighteningly calm. "And nobody moves him unless I say." The stable doors slammed open against the storm moments later. Men carried Noah inside while horses kicked nervously in nearby stalls. The smell of hay, blood, sweat, and smoke filled the air almost instantly. Vivian transformed the place without wasting a breath. Boiling water over iron burners, knives heating above flame. Clean sheets spread across a feed table. Wyatt stood beside her the entire time, handing over whatever she asked for before the words fully left her mouth. Noah drifted in and out beneath the lantern glow. His small fingers clutched weakly at Vivian's sleeve once. "Am I dying?" Vivian brushed damp hair back from his forehead. "Not tonight." Outside, the storm battered Frost Ridge for hours. Inside the stable, time narrowed into breath, blood, and shaking lantern light. Vivian worked with rolled sleeves and steady hands while snow hissed against the roof overhead. Sweat gathered near her temples despite the cold. Once her fingers trembled briefly from exhaustion. Wyatt noticed. Without speaking, he slid a fresh towel into her hand. That small gesture steadied her more than rest could have. Near dawn, the bleeding finally slowed. Noah's breathing eased. The stable fell silent except for the storm fading beyond the walls. Vivian stepped back slowly from the table. For a second, she simply stood there, staring at her hands stained dark beneath the lantern glow. Then Noah's father began crying quietly beside his son. One by one, the ranch hands removed their hats. Nobody spoke. They only looked at her differently now, like something had changed during the night. Wyatt crossed the stable floor slowly. "You saved him," he said. Vivian looked exhausted enough to fall where she stood. "I almost lost him twice, but you didn't." The words settled deep between them, warm, certain. Outside, dawn crept pale across the frozen ranch. Snow drifted softly from the stable roof while men began rebuilding the broken fence line. For the first time since arriving at Frost Ridge, Vivian Brooks no longer looked like a stranger standing in the middle of someone else's life. She looked like she belonged there. And that was the exact moment another rider appeared, through the morning snow beyond the main gate. Tall horse, black coat, Eastern saddlebags strapped behind the seat. Wyatt's expression changed the instant he saw him. The rider dismounted slowly beneath the Frost Ridge sign. Then his eyes settled directly on Vivian. Cold recognition flickered across his face. "Doctor." Malcolm Pierce smiled faintly beneath the falling snow. "Well," he said softly, "I was beginning to wonder where you disappeared to." The stable yard went still. Snow drifted between the men in slow white streaks, while the morning wind carried the smell of horses and wet leather across Frost Ridge. Noah's father tightened his arm protectively around the boy standing beside him. Vivian felt every bit of warmth leave her body. Malcolm Pierce removed his gloves, one finger at a time. Same polished boots, same silver watch chain hanging across his vest. He looked more like a banker than a doctor. Only his eyes remained unchanged, cold, certain. Wyatt stepped forward slightly. "You know him?" he asked, without taking his eyes off Malcolm. Vivian swallowed once before answering. "Yes." Malcolm brushed snow from his sleeve. "Miss Brooks worked under my supervision in St. Louis." His mouth curved faintly. "Until certain concerns forced the hospital board to remove her." Nobody spoke. The ranch hands shifted uneasily near the stable doors. Harlan folded his arms across his chest. "What kind of concerns?" Vivian's fingers tightened around the blood-stained towel, still hanging at her side. Malcolm answered before she could. "Professional misconduct." He glanced toward the stable where Noah slept wrapped in blankets, and behavior unbecoming of medical practice. The words landed harder than the wind. Wyatt's expression did not change. But Vivian noticed the muscle tightening once along his jaw. Malcolm reached into his coat and pulled out folded papers stamped with official seals. "I'm here on behalf of the Colorado Medical Review Office," he continued smoothly. "Imagine my surprise hearing rumors of an unlicensed woman performing procedures in ranch stables." Noah's father stepped forward suddenly. "She saved my son." Malcolm barely looked at him. "That does not change the law." The silence afterward felt ugly, not loud, not angry, just uncertain. And uncertain spreads quickly in small towns. By evening, the whispers had already reached Black Hollow. Vivian heard them the next morning while buying lamp oil at Mercer's General Store. "That's her. Heard she got thrown out back east." Wyatt Bennett's gone soft. Conversation stopped when she approached the counter. The clerk avoided her eyes while wrapping the oil bottle in newspaper. Outside, church bells rang through town beneath a gray winter sky. Vivian returned to Frost Ridge with the supplies balanced carefully beside her on the wagon seat. Snowmelt dripped steadily from the rooftops. Somewhere behind the mountains, another storm gathered. That night, only 2 ranch hands came to her cabin for treatment. The next day, nobody came at all. Martha brought supper after dark and found Vivian cleaning instruments that no longer needed cleaning. "You should eat," the older woman muttered. Vivian kept polishing the forceps with a cloth. "I'm not hungry." Martha stood near the stove a long moment before speaking again. "People scare easy around things they don't understand." Vivian gave a tired smile without looking up. "No," she said softly. "People understand exactly enough." After Martha left, Vivian sat alone listening to wind rattle the cabin windows. Across the yard, light still burned inside Wyatt's house. Twice she thought about walking there. Twice she stayed where she was. The next afternoon, Harn cornered Wyatt beside the horse trough while ranch hands unloaded feed sacks nearby. "She's becoming a problem." Wyatt kept splitting ice from the water barrels with the back of an axe. "She's done more good here than most men ever will. That doesn't matter if town council turns against us." Harlan lowered his voice. "You've got contracts waiting in Denver come spring. Buyers hear enough scandal, and they'll walk." Wyatt finally looked at him then. Cold enough to stop further talking for a moment. But Harlan pressed anyway. "You don't even know if she's telling the truth." From the cabin porch, Vivian heard every word. Wyatt said nothing. Not agreement, not defense, Nothing. And somehow that silence cut deeper than Malcolm Pierce ever could. That night, Vivian packed her belongings slowly. The medical bag, the photograph of her mother, 2 dresses, the wool gloves Wyatt had given her at Black Hollow Station rested folded beside the lantern. She stared at them for a very long time before placing them carefully into the bag too. Outside, snow began falling again. By midnight, the storm had returned full force. Vivian pulled on her coat and stepped onto the porch, just as frantic hoofbeats thundered across the yard. Sheriff Amos Reed climbed down from his horse, half breathless. "Miss Brooks?" He stopped himself awkwardly, then tried again. "My wife's in labor." Snow clung thick to his beard. "Baby's turned wrong. She's bleeding." Vivian said nothing. The sheriff looked ashamed just standing there. "Doc Wilkes won't leave town in this weather." His voice cracked slightly. "Please." For a moment only, the storm answered. Then Vivian reached back inside for her medical bag. The sheriff's house sat near the edge of Black Hollow beside the frozen creek road. Lamps burned in every window by the time they arrived. Inside, the air smelled of sweat, blood, and boiled water. "Mrs. Reed," cried out weakly from the bedroom, while 2 frightened neighbor women stood near the stove, wringing towels between shaking hands. Vivian removed her coat immediately. "Heat more water," she ordered calmly. "And somebody keep those lamps full." The next hours blurred together beneath thunderous wind and flickering light. Outside, the storm buried the town deeper beneath snow. Inside, Vivian worked steadily, while Sheriff Reed paced the hallway hard enough to wear grooves into the floorboards. Near dawn, a baby finally cried, thin at first, then strong. Mrs. Reed collapsed back against the pillows, sobbing with relief, while Vivian wrapped the infant girl carefully in blankets. The sheriff stood frozen in the doorway, staring at his wife and daughter, like a man seeing daylight after months underground. "You saved them," he whispered. Vivian lowered tired eyes toward the child in her arms. For the first time in weeks, somebody in Black Hollow looked at her without suspicion. Only gratitude. Outside, dawn light touched the snow-covered town, and somewhere beyond the storm, Frost Ridge waited in silence. Maybe that's the part that stays with you long after the story ends. Not the snow, not the courtroom, not even the ranch itself. Maybe it's the thought of what happens when one person decides not to look away. Because most people in Black Hollow saw a tired woman sitting alone at a train station and kept walking. Wyatt Bennett stopped, and that single choice carried warmth into a life that had nearly gone cold for good. If you've ever felt unwanted, forgotten, or like the world already made up its mind about who you were, then maybe you understand Vivian more than you think. Sometimes healing doesn't begin with grand speeches. Sometimes it begins with a quiet room, a steady hand, or someone leaving a lantern burning so you know where home is. And maybe love is really just that. Someone staying when it would have been easier to leave. If this story touched something in you, tell me where you're watching from. Or simply leave a lantern in the comments, so others know they're not alone either. And if you'd like to spend a little more time out here beneath these western skies, there are still more stories waiting down the trail. More storms, more second chances, more people searching for a place to belong.